Great. Okay, wonderful. I think this is the first presentation I've given where I can see the audience. This is wonderful to get to see everyone here in the room. Just so you guys know, you are my people, the diehards, right to the end, of the conference. I always think it's amazing when people stick around for the final presentations. And so I'm really excited to talk with you guys, and actually really excited to listen to some of the presentations as well. In particular Lesley's, because mine is actually focused on healthcare as well. And just to provide a little bit of context, I've been working with a very large healthcare organization here in my home province of Alberta. Alberta Health Services has 100,000 healthcare providers or healthcare people involved. And one of the things that we've been working on, that I've been working on, I guess, for the past few years, is creating the patient and family storytelling playlist with digital stories. So we've created over 100 digital stories now with patient and family advisors, and those are used all over the place in healthcare quality improvement initiatives, in patient engagement, in conferences. A lot of people share them at the beginning of staff meetings to sort of bring the patient voice and patient experience into daily clinical practice. And I know the NHS has been a leader in this, and I've been reading from over here in Canada about some of the stuff that Pip Hardy and Tony Summers have been doing with patient voices, and also what's been happening in NHS. So anyways, I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about sort of that healthcare context for digital storytelling. What I'm going to be sharing with you guys today is actually a little piece of my PhD thesis that I just finished back in November about axioms of ownership and utility in healthcare-focused digital storytelling projects, because I work primarily in healthcare with a lot of different charities and healthcare organizations. And generally, I first introduced to it people first contact me through their communications person. And so that has led to a bit of complications sometimes about to talk about digital storytelling and sort of the different ways that they're approached than other traditional sort of media products. Really quickly, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Mike Lang. I'm a full-time digital storytelling facilitator. I work with organizations around the world, and I also get to train people to do digital storytelling. And I just recently completed my PhD looking specifically at digital storytelling in a healthcare setting. Part of that PhD was I actually made a documentary film where I filmed an entire workshop from start to finish with young adult cancer survivors. And at some points in my presentation, I will reference this film. We watched it yesterday here at the conference, but you can see it online if you'd like to see it. And I put it in the link in the chat. If you just search Mike Lang Stories on YouTube, you'll be able to watch it. And so hopefully, that will be provide some context a bit more about what I'm doing. Like I said, I appreciate you guys are sort of the diehards at the end of the conference. This presentation, I actually decided to go old school and to actually read my paper. So I've written a paper about this. I'm testing these ideas out on you guys, and I wanted to read it to you. And so hopefully maybe we'll have a bit of time for discussion afterwards. The title of the paper, the subheading of the opening part of the paper here is called Beyond the White Gloves. And the opening quote is from Friedrich Nietzsche, saying the great problems are to be encountered in the street. So here we go. For good reason, academia is vigilant when it comes to research ethics. However, at times, academic discussions of ethics can feel like an English butler walking the hallways of the ivory tower with white gloves on, searching for minuscule traces of dirt on lampshades and banisters. Every surface in academia is expected to be spotless, but in the street, just outside the doors of the ivory tower, dirt is everywhere. Caked under fingernails, embedded in clothes, smeared on faces. In the messy world of praxis, white gloves and the traces of dust they discover can quickly become meaningless. This metaphor is a salient description of my work as a digital storytelling facilitator over the past decade. Digital storytelling is by nature ethically fraught and messy, as all digital stories begin in the muck and mud of difficult life experiences. That is, without conflict, there is no story. In contrast to other story forms, digital stories often contain identifiable information, involve many actors with potentially competing interests, and once shared online publicly, they are difficult to oversee. Therefore, both inside and outside the walls of academia, the traditional boilerplate ethical approaches to confidentiality, informed consent, data store and removal, etc., must be handled differently. In a practice context, certain ethical concepts, such as shaping a story, representation and harm, ownership, distribution methods, and the inevitable fuzzy boundaries of most projects, are most pertinent to ethical digital storytelling than the basic tenets of research and ethics. A side note here, one concrete example from my PhD work was the continual consent protocol that I had to develop for my PhD research. And this process was a departure from the traditional conceptualizations of informed consent, where it's sort of done one time upfront for the rest of the project. I had to explain many times actually to the research ethics board how that is not an ethical approach to digital storytelling, because no one knows the story they're going to tell until they get to the end of the project. And so we need to have this. So I created a continual consent process. So anyway, said differently, digital storytelling praxis requires trading in the white gloves for ones that are made to work in the dirt. And this paper is a cursory glimpse of the ethical work gloves that I endeavor to put on every day as a digital storytelling facilitator, by describing one of the ethically muddy situations that I encounter frequently and discussing how I try and mitigate the challenges it presents. It's my hope to demonstrate that in digital storytelling praxis, it is more important to learn how to work in the dirt than to attempt to avoid every trace of it. So here's the subheading, the de-commodification of stories, addressing the axioms of ownership and utilities. So at the beginning of this, I'm citing an email that I received from the communications officer from a large healthcare organization, not Alberta Health Services, a different one. And this is the initial email I got from them. Mike, we love your digital stories and would like you to work with us. Could you produce 20 stories by the end of the month? How much would that cost? Also, we would like to get all the raw project files so that we can use the footage in other content. So I'm sure many of you maybe have interacted with people who sort of address digital storytelling in that way. Here we go. I collaborate with many nonprofit health-focused organizations as a digital storytelling facilitator, including regional and provincial healthcare systems, disease-specific charities, and academic institutions. Often the initial contact emails I receive from these organizations are similar in tone and content to the email quoted above. In most cases, the marketing and communications professionals, managers, or researchers who approach me do not understand what the digital storytelling process entails, even if they have watched many digital stories or have read published digital storytelling literature. The challenge of formulating a suitable response to these type of emails was one of the motivating factors behind the unique study design of my PhD thesis, where I created a documentary film that chronicles a workshop from start to finish. Creating this documentary as part of my data collection both enabled an in-depth exploration of the digital storytelling experiences of adolescent and young adult cancer survivors, and it provided an imminent response to those types of questions. It is clear to anyone who watches Emerging Horizons that digital stories are purposefully crafted, meaning-laden, and deeply personal. Therefore, they cannot be produced with minimal planning or forethought, nor should they be cut up into smaller pieces and used for other purposes. Most importantly, they should not be treated as commodities to be bought and sold and traded. A digital story is a direct representation of the human life that created it, and humans are not commodities. Early in my career as a digital storytelling facilitator, I did not realize the uniqueness of these digital storytelling axioms, and it was constantly confounded by my initial conversations with interested organizations. However, after attending 2 graduate-level entrepreneurship courses and briefly engaging with the business and organizational development literature, the source of the disconnect became apparent. The writings of early communications and marketing narrative theorists and the current trends that they have spawned, such as story selling, a story brand, or storynomics, are clearly based in a Western capitalist transactional paradigm and its core axioms of ownership. That is, if I pay for something, I own it, and utility. That is, things are only useful if it helps me get what I want in the way that I want it. The different approaches to these underlying values can create a disconnect between the core ethical principles of digital storytelling facilitation and the ideas and desires of commissioning organizations like healthcare organizations. Therefore, the very first step in ethical digital storytelling praxis is to clarify the transaction that is taking place, and in doing so, address these issues of ownership and utility. In my initial contact conversation with a commissioning healthcare organization, I begin by explicitly stating that they are paying for the service of skilled facilitation, not for the digital stories that are being produced. That is, you're paying for a service, not a product. This means that the commissioning organization will not own the digital stories. Ethically, participants in a digital storytelling project should own their digital story because it's their life, their words and images, and their creativity that produce the story. Clarifying the ownership of digital stories in this way directly confounds the natural proclivity of modern organizations to commodify everything around them, including sometimes their very own stakeholders. This shift in ownership causes the subsequent discussion surrounding digital storytelling to take on a new participant-focused dimension and emphasizes that a core axiom of digital storytelling is a commitment to an ongoing, mutually beneficial relationship, not a simple transactional exchange of goods. That is money for stories. And a side note here, this distinction also sort of disrupts the prevalent approach to consent used in most businesses and organizational development contexts. The commissioning organization is not asking people for consent to collect and own the stories that are created, but instead for consent to share the stories on the participants' behalf. And so in Alberta Health Services, all the stories we have on the website, AHS knows they do not own those. They are just sharing them to maximize their impact and enhance the storyteller well-being. So in this storyteller-focused paradigm, the primary aim of digital storytelling projects is to provide stakeholder groups with an opportunity for personal development, that is, enhanced storyteller well-being. And the ensuing possibilities for sharing the digital stories to achieve organizational goals becomes a secondary aim. Following this initial discussion, I explained that because the organization does not own the stories that are produced, they cannot directly control the content. The idea that it's unethical to tell a storyteller what they can or cannot include in their own story is surprisingly absent from some initial conversations. Consequently, the organization will not be able to directly control the utility of the digital stories to achieve their desired goals. All they can control is where, how, or if the story is shared through their various communication channels. This is understandably unnerving for many communication professionals and researchers, as targeting and controlling the message is a central component of the deductive approach to storytelling that's utilized in most business communications and knowledge translation models. The traditional deductive approach to storytelling communications starts by identifying organizational goals, choosing specific messages to connected to those goals, and then finding people to tell the stories that contain those messages. In this case, the utility of a story to address specific organizational goals is assured. Alternatively, the inductive approach of digital storytelling begins by finding people with lived experience of the topic area. And then, after the story is created, discovering how that story connects to organizational messages and goals. Using this approach, there's always a chance that the stories created may not connect to the predetermined messages or organizational goals, and therefore the utility of a digital story cannot be guaranteed. Despite some initial hesitancy, most organizations eventually recognize the potential of this inductive approach utilized in digital storytelling. Paradoxically, many discovered that by relinquishing ownership of the stories and control of the message to stakeholder groups through the digital storytelling process, their organizational communications become more relevant, more meaningful, and more compelling. It may seem a little tactless beginning conversations with commissioning organizations by explaining that they will be paying for something that they do not own and they cannot control. However, clarifying these ethically muddy waters and de-commodifying the digital stories that are produced has proven to be an important starting point to achieve my own goal of practicing ethical digital storytelling facilitation in the marketplace. So here's my closing. I called it an ethical dis-position. Redefining dominant cultural ideas of ownership and utility is just one example of the many challenges of digital storytelling facilitation, and demonstrates that ethical practice begins well before participants are contacted and continues long after the stories are completed. Often, mediating the relationship between the commissioning organization and the storyteller can be the most ethically complex aspect of digital storytelling facilitation. And compared with those muddy waters, the potential ethical issues that could have arisen during my PhD research project seem like dust on a lampshade. Regardless, both hermeneutic research in the ivory tower and the ethical digital storytelling praxis out in the street requires a rigorous practice of attentiveness, openness, discernment, tact, and discipline, and a disposition. Of these traits, a primary disposition towards safeguarding and enhancing storyteller well-being at all phases of the process, as well as the ability to disposition dominant organizational and cultural attitudes towards storytelling may be the most vital and ethical for digital storytelling praxis. Indeed, a deeply personal goal of mine as both a patient advocate and digital storytelling professional is to actively disposition current attitudes towards storytelling in health and wellness contexts. The rise of patient engagement in healthcare systems, the increased focus on direct knowledge translation of research to stakeholder groups, and story-based marketing and communications in the charitable sector has led to patients and families increasingly being asked to share personal health stories at planning meetings, conferences, fundraisers, and newsletters, on websites, and in social media. The substantial ethical hazard accompanying this new abundance of storytelling opportunities in health and wellness contexts is a potentially flippant attitude towards the creation and sharing of personal health stories. The question needs to be posed: do healthcare systems, charities, and researchers really understand what they are asking of patients and families when they approach them to share a health story? The substantial amount of emotional energy invested by the young adult cancer survivors in my PhD thesis as they found, told, crafted, and shared their stories was eminent. And yet, patients and families are routinely asked to do all of this and more with little acknowledgement of the time, effort, and energy expended. In a similar way, I routinely encounter healthcare professionals and researchers that drastically underestimate the amount of technical skill, ethical awareness, and storytelling expertise that's required to facilitate digital storytelling experiences that enhance storyteller well-being. In healthcare digital storytelling praxis, undervaluing people's stories and the expertise required to craft those stories and share them in meaningful and compelling ways is as ethically questionable as the propensity towards commodification of the stories, as previously discussed. In other words, when it comes to patient and family storytelling, the ivory tower may not be as spotless as we like to believe. Ultimately, this paper is an exhortation, warning, and a reminder for me to purposely cultivate an ethical disposition towards patients and family stories, and not allow myself or others to commodify them or undervalue them. It is my enduring goal to be prepared for the inevitable messy situations of digital storytelling praxis by continually putting on my work gloves and not becoming complacent. Thankfully, I now have another tool to assist in working through these ethically muddy situations of digital storytelling praxis. I begin every conversation with a commissioning organization, a researcher, or a potential digital storyteller by saying, "Watch my PhD film, and then we can talk." That's the end.
Thank you, Michael. I think if folks have questions, we've got time for a couple of questions. And if you can be loud, I think Michael should be able to hear you, or if not, if you want to come a little closer.
Hi, Michael. Tony from Patient Voices. You're basically speaking what I love to hear, so it's great. I wonder how you. My only thought was how you get around the use of, if you use stock images, how you get around the licensing conditions for those if you don't retain copyright of the story.
Okay. Good. That's a good question. Yeah, I think we're using a lot of royalty-free. There's some of them that use royalty-free stock images, right? And a lot of the ones that we use, I can transfer licensing to participants. And so Envato Elements is one of the ones I use, and you can actually, when you use a stock image, you can transfer that license to someone that's used it, even though it was purchased through my a subscription. So, so yeah, that's sort of how I sort of stick with very specific websites that I understand the processes with, because sometimes it can be that is a huge challenge, right? But yeah, that's sort of how we do it. And when people sign the consent form, in particular for AHS, which is the largest one that I've worked on, those 100 stories, it's very explicit that the copyright does not belong to the organization. It belongs to the individual, and the individual is giving permission. They're basically licensing the healthcare organization to share the story on their behalf to maximize its potential impact. So that's sort of the language that we use around that. It's great to meet you, Tony. I've read all your stuff and I've been watching you guys for a long time. I wish that I could connect it earlier. So.
I feel your pain when you say comms department, because
yeah, I think everyone does, right? They because to them, right, and my other side of my life is documentary filmmaking, and I do a number of industry funded documentary films in addition to all my digital storytelling work, and they really view stories as commodities, and so do marketing communication professionals, and that's where the idea of this paper came from was that language and that approach to people and their experiences. It doesn't translate into digital storytelling, but they think it does. And we need to be really clear about how, how digital storytelling is different. It's not a commodity, right? And yeah, I love the thumbs up because, I see the way that you guys have been doing things in the NHS and patient voices. And that's a lot of what some of these ideas have come from.
Is there a question by chance from anybody online that would like to unmute or type it in the chat? Or anybody here? All right. Thank you, Michael.
Sure. All right.
No, is it possible to ask then? I just didn't want to take a space because I already asked Mike one question. So, but if nobody from the studio wants to ask, can I just clarify something? Is it all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Okay.
If the result of the digital storytelling cannot be used to be shown to be used by the commissioners, what would be for them an interest in financial support of that workshop?
Mm-hmm. Great question. First of all, I'll say you would be incredibly surprised what I have got Alberta Health Services to publish on their YouTube channel about themselves. It's amazing. When you have an organization that is committed to learning from patients and families, they will not shy away from things that are critical of them, right? But it does take a lot of conversations. I have conversations with the comms department quite often to say, look, yes, this speaks critically of this experience. However, we want to demonstrate we're a learning organization. We want to honor patient and family voices. We want to create a culture of person-centeredness. I use all this language and over time, I break them down and we publish it anyway, even though it's critical. And I love that about, when people are willing to share stories that maybe don't share them in a positive light, but it is a tension, right? There is a tension there and a bit of friction sometimes. So once the stories are created, you really do have to shepherd them in many ways and be a caretaker of those stories within the organization. I have a number of high-level people who, including the CEO of Alberta Health Services, who fully believes in digital storytelling. And only once did I have to go to her and say, hey, they don't want to post this story. And she said, we're posting it. and so that does happen. If there is something, and it hasn't happened yet with AHS, but sometimes there is a story. I just finished some on PTSD with with the Veterans Affairs here in Canada, the large government organization. There's a couple stories that were very critical and potentially, had negative implications for the storyteller and the others in the story as well. And so in that case, those stories are going to be used primarily for internal use. They're not going to be public facing stories. And so there's always ways to share a story. And actually an ethical, I think, implication is you have to, right? You have to share the stories because they created them, and you have to honor people's vulnerability in creating those stories by using them in the most effective way that enhances well-being. And so if someone creates a story that is not going to enhance their own well-being, if it's shared publicly online, then you find other ways to share it. And internally is probably one of the best ways to do that. So some of these PTSD stories are being used in internal staff training. And not shared online.
Oh, what I see, what you are using the stories on your YouTube channel. So is it right? You are using the stories what are created. So you got the patients or whatever people you help, facilitated, you've got their permission.
So there's a few of them that I reach out to and or that are part of a workshop and just say, Mike, please share these as much places we want. And Mike, can you put them on your YouTube channel? And so I leave it up to them to jump to me. A lot of what I do on my YouTube channel is I link to playlists. So when I work with other organizations and they share their stories publicly, then I link to that playlist on my YouTube channel. So I'm not actually hosting the stories myself. I'm just sort of driving people that direction towards watching those stories.
Do I understand you right? What the commissioners would be interested to finance the project like that, because this is a learning process for them. And they've got materials what they could use internally to teach their staff. Is it right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that that internal piece is what AHS is focused on, but they also have allowed these stories to be front facing so that the public can watch them. And I think combined that the Patient Stories playlist on AHS has over 250,000 views. And it's actually their most highest viewed video content for the entire organization is the digital stories that are created. And so it is a very, it's a wonderful investment for them. And they absolutely love the stories that are created, even if they are slightly critical sometimes of the organization and the way things work. So anyway, sorry, I think we need to stop now, but thanks for the questions, Irina. I appreciate it.
My name is Lesley Goodburn. I work at NHS England, NHS Improving. I'm the Experience of Care Lead for Provider Improvement, and I'm here with my colleague, Kat. Hi all. Hi all. Kat works with me on the stories as Experience of Care Support Manager. So before we go into the slides, I'm just going to tell you a little tiny story. So imagine you're in a loving relationship. You're both going up to 50. You're going to be celebrating your 10th wedding anniversary. You've saved up some money and you've booked the trip of a lifetime to China to go and see the Great Wall, see the Terracotta Army, the pandas at Chengdu. You've booked all this and that's the plan for September. So you're going to be celebrating. But then one of you feels a little bit unwell, goes to the GPs, is referred, goes to the GP 2 or 3 times over 2 weeks, and then eventually is referred to the hospital. Is kept in overnight, and then the next day is diagnosed with late stage pancreatic cancer, and you're told that actually time is short, no signs or symptoms as there isn't with pancreatic cancer, and you're thrust into a world of end of life and palliative care that you weren't expecting to experience. Imagine you do that and the care isn't quite the way you would want it to be for the person that you love, and you try to advocate for them, and you work in the English NHS, so you know what family and person-centred care might look like. But unfortunately, the person that you love dies in a hospital when they wanted to die at home. If you shared that story with the NHS, you would want them to make some improvements to change things. That's what happened to me. My husband, Seth, was 49, no signs or symptoms of pancreatic cancer until 2 weeks before, at which point it was too late for any intervention. People with pancreatic cancer usually get a late stage diagnosis. 1 in 4 people die within a month, 3 in 4 people die within a year. After Seth died, I tried to share that story to improve things for other people. But 8 months after sharing that story, no one came back to me and nothing changed. So that's why stories are really important to me, because I've tried to share mine and no one listened and nothing changed. So that's a little bit about me and what drives me. Yesterday, we completed, Kat and I did, slides for today. We had animations and all kinds of things. We sent the email off to Sally and the presentation didn't arrive. Overnight, my iPhone was updated and it locked me out of my NHS account, and it also locked me out of my NHS computer, which meant I couldn't get to the slides. So we're going to share some slides with you today, but many of them are screenshots with no animations as we'd planned. So
just turning the camera to
thank
you. So
That's fine, no problem.
Yeah.
So so we're going to go through some work that we've been doing in NHS England, but that's just to give you a little bit of background. Are you able to press a button, Kath? So the work that I do as Experience of Care Lead for Provider Improvement is with all the provider organisations across the NHS, 242 organisations, acute mental health, community and ambulance trusts. And as part of that work, I do work on organisational development around patient experience, looking at leadership, culture, learning, collecting data, triangulating data. And that's all really interesting work. But one of my passions in the work that I do is something called the Heads of Patient Experience Network, the HOPE Network. And that's made up of, at the minute, over 700 people who lead on patient experience work across those trusts. And I'm going to share our journey over the last couple of years around patient stories. So I'm going to share the HOPE Network.
Sorry, press the wrong thing.
That's all right. After the traumas we've had, that's no trauma. So the Heads of Patient Experience Network have 4 aims, which are along the bottom: to learn and network, to influence policy, share practice, and develop leadership and skills in patient experience. At the start of the pandemic, we had 250 members. We've currently got over 780. Most of those members are made up of acute trusts, mental health, community and ambulance. But increasingly, we're getting cancer alliances, academic health science networks, hospices, charities, primary care join in as well. And right at the start of the pandemic in March 2020, as with everyone, we were in a place where it wasn't really about patient experience, it was about saving lives. All the surveys that we did stopped, all the complaints that we did were paused, and many of those heads of patient experience were sent back to the front line because they got clinical qualifications, and the others sort of stood back and didn't quite know what to do. So very quickly we got them online. We started to meet every week. We set up a platform where people could start to share. We got people developing standard operating procedures around letters to loved ones, virtual visiting, infection control procedures, bereavement support, getting possessions to people admitted to hospital, getting possessions back when someone had sadly died. And through sort of March to June, over those 12 weeks, we really focused and we moved away from data and we moved towards person-centered compassionate care. And at that point in time, we decided that it was the perfect opportunity, even in a pandemic, to try and ingrain stories into the work, because we could talk about narrative, it wasn't about data. So we pulled together 14 heads of patient experience to be part of the steering group. We involved them in the planning. So we moved from weekly meetings to fortnightly meetings. We'd have monthly webinars, quarterly meetings where we'd focus in on particular subjects, a yearly conference, and storytelling came out as one of the things that people really wanted to do. So we knew of Prue's work in Swansea. We contacted Prue and decided that we'd do some work on storytelling. We did the digital storytelling training. We also did some work around oral histories, bereavement and ICU. So just to set the context, this work that we're going to share today has really come from the HOPE Network and this desire to move away from data and move towards narrative and story. So there you go. as if I didn't know what the next slide was going to be. Exactly that. So if we move on one again, Kath. Brilliant. So the NHS is fantastic at doing all these national surveys, getting mountains and mountains of data, but really poor at being able to demonstrate how that data changes things. One more, Kat. Oh, and another one.
Would you mind speaking up a little bit? Because I'm struggling to.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
So we really wanted to move towards narrative and storytelling. And if we click on one, Kat. So we decided that there was qualitative data, quantitative data, and underpinning that was the narrative, and that's what we wanted to explore. So we contacted Prue to see what we could do with the digital stories. That was in July 2020. Since then, we've put over 80 people through the training. They're people who lead patient experience in some of those organisations. And they've all gone out and done things with the digital stories. So one of our wonderful digital storytellers, Kathy Walsh from Wirral and Cheshire and Wirral Partnership Trust, then took Prue's training and trained her staff on how to collect stories. So took them through the 9 sessions that were needed. And trained, I think she's trained about 25, 30 of her people who now go out and collect stories. And if you want to see some of them, they're on her website. And if we do one click, we should see. There we go. It's not quite the way we planned because we pulled these slides together today. So Kathy's work you can find there. There are patient stories, but there are also staff stories. So all of the people who went through the training went back to their own organisations and did the work on digital stories. Others who sort of led the way were hopefully Karen from, with one click, oh brilliant. So Karen from Royal Brampton and Harefield Hospitals has been training her patient group to go out and collect patient stories with other patients for improvement. So there's a whole listen, learn and lead initiative there going on. And then our colleagues up at Humber Teaching Trust, the Mental Health Trust, developed their own online digital storytelling modules so that patients at the Recovery College could create their own digital stories based on Prue's training again. So some examples of how we've used that. We've also been using it from a national point of view from an NHS England point of view, taking digital stories to the Quality and Innovation Board and letting the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Nursing Officer, the Chief Transformation Officer, any Chief Officer within NHS England gets to hear one of the digital patient stories and put some improvements in place. So we've got over 80 people in the network who can do the stories. We're building momentum. We're building that momentum through NHS England too. So we're now in the place where we're trying to consolidate that and begin to measure that. So I'm going to hand over. Is that all right, Kath? We'll swap places.
Swap places. So first thing this morning, we heard Diane talk about listening. And then a bit later this morning, I heard Chris Lomas talk about responsiveness to stories. And as Lesley said, when we're talking about patient experience, and myself as a nurse and as an ex-head of patient experience, when I take a story, the patient or the carer or the family member generally say what they want to happen with the story, and pretty much always they want something to happen. Some of them just want to share it, but most people have something that they want to happen. So we've been thinking, how can we try measures? Perhaps the wrong word. But how can we demonstrate the impact of the stories that we're taking to the board? So I've been taking stories to the board for I don't know, 10 years or so, and so I've sort of put a draft infographic, which is here, and actually I think in terms of spread, I think listening to Chris Lomas's work earlier on, I'm going to change that to amplification, because I quite like the fact it's voices and it's amplified rather than spread. Sounds like something it is on one level, like your butter on your toast. So we're trying to measure the impact and go back to the board and say, this is what's happened as a result of that story. Most importantly, go back to the patient, the carer, the family member who's told the story, and show to them what's happened as a result of their intense bravery at telling their story. Can't think what was. So whenever Leslie's been sharing stories, there is feedback from them. Were you going to say anything else other than that, which we'll show you in a minute? Some feedback.
Yeah,
you can tell we were very prepared for this last minute presentation.
I think there was something here about feedback from the people who share the story, what they wanted, how it felt to them, what the impact has been, but also feedback from people who've seen the story and how it's affected them. So we're kind of developing this from a national point of view, but also thinking about how we can work with the trust to develop this further for them to use a similar sort of model. So not only thinking about
this is very much work in progress, but intuitively it's feeling sort of right. And as I say, in a minute we'll show you one that Lesley has completed for one of the stories that she has shared. As part, it's just part of a slide pack really that goes along. So my intention is that you show what when the story was, what happened, and in each of these things, my intention would be that there's a bit of narrative, a bit of explanation around what happened at each of the stages, so you can, in a very quick glance, because I'm a really simple person and I like pictures and I love stories. So a combination of something that's really simple and shows a picture and shows that story to me is, I think, might work. I hope. And then,
so if we go to that little clip of Ruth now.
Little clip of Ruth. Yes. Hit escape. Yeah.
And then just the bottom of the web browser.
The mouse doesn't want to play.
There you go.
There we go.
That's it. So I'm
not sure if that's shared.
Oh, okay.
It says I'm screen sharing.
It's the audio, isn't it?
It might be the PowerPoint. I think.
Okay.
I can sort that out.
Thank you.
So for the stories that we've been taking to the NHS England board, we've had the support of the Chief Nurse, Ruth May, for NHS England. We did a little storytelling festival in March to
turn this around so people can show
stories and other types of stories. And Ruth came along to one of those sessions. She's going to share some of the things that she said in terms of what she got from the kind of support.
Yeah, that's
NHS
perfect.
England.
I think.
The other thing to mention is, and it links back to my story, Ruth's father also died of pancreatic cancer. So before I worked for NHS England Improvement, through Twitter, I asked for people to share stories, and Ruth, who was an executive nurse for NHS Improvement, didn't really know what that meant, but it felt like she was quite high up in the hierarchy, contacted me and wanted to share the story. So I'm not going to share the bit that she talked about her own story, but I think part of the reason for supporting this work that we've been doing is that she knows the vulnerability of sharing a personal story through a digital story. And I think it's helped her to understand being a participant as well. So if we just press play, it's only a couple of minutes. It just gives a little bit of background from.
I can't see where it is to press
Oh,
play.
sorry.
That's all right. Is that... No. Let's turn you around. Turn me around so I can get the mouse to work.
Lesley and I have been working professionally on some stories going to every quality innovation committee, our subcommittee for quality each month. Every meeting that we meet, Lord Aradazi chairs it, and there's another load of lords, ladies and knights as part of the committee. And every meeting we start with a patient story. And that's really important because it sets the tone of the meeting, it sets and reminds people why we are there. And Lesley will confirm, I'm sure, but Ara always says, and this is the favourite part of the meeting for me, because it grounds us in why we're here. So the power of it is really important for setting a tone. But we had two stories recently, one of Vicky, Vicky, a young lady with breast cancer, wasn't able to get the diagnosis and her family being in the right time to have that. And that's why yesterday's visiting guidance was really quite prescriptive, more prescriptive than we've ever been, about making sure people are there. So it does have an influence. And lastly, we've had the last one, I think it was, we had Sophie's story, which is a young girl. I think she's 9, but she died last August when she was just 10, who diagnosed with a rare cancer. Sophie's mum Charlotte presented the story, but also you heard I'm laughing because we also heard Sophie laughing a lot during her story, with about her ice cream van. We heard an awful lot about Charlotte remembering her daughter for the funny bits, as well as the very, very sad truth that she died far too young. She wasn't complaining about the care that she received. What she was wanting, and Sophie at a very tender age of 9 was telling us the part of her bucket list was about sorting out play therapists and also food for parents and for children. And it's part of a whole load of work, that we plan to make a difference to kids, so that play therapy is there for 7 days a week and kids' food is different and parents have access to food. So it's not all sorted, but there's an awful lot of work that goes on. So my point being is, digital stories, patient stories, family stories make a difference. And thank you for the work that you do to make sure that we do just that.
So, she mentioned Vicky's story in there, and if we whiz back to the presentation to work at, if we possibly can, there are some just some stats using.
Lesley and I've been working to professionally on some.
So there are just some stats around Vicky's
Stop
story.
sharing. No, I think we're talking. Okay. Pardon. Yeah, I'd just like to make it full screen.
We don't want to interrupt. The story that she mentioned, Vicky's plea, has been to 4 different board meetings. It's been to 5 conferences. It's been to a matrons conference, a ward leaders conference, a heads of nursing conference, an infection control conference. We've had 92 pieces of feedback so far from the stories. We've got 10 actions that are underway. We know it's reached at least 500 people, but the people who've taken it from the conferences, we don't know who it's gone to and what effect it's had, so we really don't know where it's gone. We've improved and recognised the value of visiting and care partnering, and it started a whole tranche of work around developing an NHS England care partner policy. So just to kind of turn a story into Kat's infographic, and then if we just click forward, there should be 4 little bits of feedback around Vicky's story. Very powerful, really want to share it, and will do. Chief nurses should also hear it and realise common sense needs applying with all the guidance. What an articulate and emotional commentary. You can certainly understand the compassion, raw emotion and empathy within this story. Just wanted to say thank you for today, such a powerful session, one I'll not forget, and really makes me feel there's so much more to be done. And I think so many of us would love to use it to bring about change, to convey the need for visiting it in a way that makes you really understand the physical and emotional impact from those important to us. We need to acknowledge the impact of not reassessing and reviewing our decisions. So this is around the sort of restricted visiting that in some hospitals is still restricted even now. So in March this year, we did a digital storytelling festival. We've got some events coming up in the coming months, and we're going to do the same next March. We've also got a sharing platform on something called NHS Futures. So if you're particularly interested in healthcare digital storytelling. There'll be some details coming out and you can access some of the resources there. And that's mine and Kat's contact details. If you want to get in touch, please do. Happy to take any questions. And if you want to see Sophie's Legacy, the other story that we talked about, we have a copy of it, but if you don't, we won't be offended. Thank you.
I have a good question. I'm very interested in the feedback piece that you mentioned, the triangulation of some of these data. Having 92 pieces of feedback that you've already collected, do you have plans of creating a measure or an instrument that can be shared with people that produce digital storytelling so that they can also conduct this feedback evaluation?
Yeah, I think it's four PowerPoint slides. As I said, I'm a simple soul, but yeah, more I'd be, if it works, I'm more, we share. We steal with pride and we give with pride. Yeah, more than happy to share.
I'm more than happy to explore that with people if you want to get in touch. One of the things that's come out of Sophie's Legacy story, the one that we might play, is that nationally we do a cancer under 16 survey. So we've got the data from a quantitative point of view. We've done some analysis on the qualitative data that's come through the free text comments, and serendipitously, the story that we shared from Sophie's Legacy matches up to the free text comments. So it started us to think about qualitative, quantitative, but also narrative, and how do we integrate those three, and how do we prove the value of stories that way. So we're going to do some more work around adult cancer surveys and stories and quantitative data.
There was a question in the chat asking, could you share an example of how you have used storytelling to influence health policy?
I think the care partner one is the one, the one from over the last couple of years, I've taken stories to the Quality and Innovation Board. Initially, it was a 5-minute story with a 10-minute discussion, 15 minutes in total. They actually asked me to make the stories longer. So they wanted a 15-minute story with a half-hour discussion. So in a 3-hour meeting, they put over 45 minutes to the digital story to watch it and discuss it. And as a direct result of 3 stories that talk about person-centred care and the need for people to be partners in care, then this whole work stream has started around care partners and developing a national policy, which wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without the stories.
I think we have plenty of time still to watch the story.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to share it, but if anybody wants to go, I won't be offended. This is Sophie's Legacy. This is the story that Ruth talked about that started the work around play specialists. There's a whole bunch of work going on around children's food, and also lobbying the Secretary of State for Health around the need to find the funding to be able to pay for food for parents, because it opens up the whole conversation. Then if you feed parents, well, what about carers? What about vulnerable people? How do we do that? Oh, you're right.
You can put it full screen as well.
So Sophie was my daughter. She was just turned 9 when she was diagnosed in September 2020, after a number of months of being unwell and back and forward to the GPs. It resulted in me taking Sophie up to A&E and just saying to them, I know something is wrong, but I don't know what. They obviously discovered a huge mass in her abdomen, which they weren't sure at the time whether it was benign or what it was. Cut a long story short, after 5 days, it resulted in surgery and they discovered that she had a 12-centimeter tumor in her abdomen, which was rhabdomyosarcoma. It was stage 3, so which was deemed obviously as positive in terms of, you know, a better chance with outcome. She was fusion negative, the tumor was, and again that was another positive in terms of outcome. She also did go and undergo chemotherapy. She had 9 very aggressive rounds of chemotherapy, which was every 3 weeks, which she found very tough. You know, she's a child's body of, you know, 9 given drugs that, you know, essentially are given to adults. She was extremely sick. She hated being in hospitals. She had never spent one night in a hospital before being diagnosed. She obviously would go either during chemo in hospital, or she would go in between her chemo rounds, resulted in being admitted to hospital because of the side effects of the drugs, and would spend probably more time than actually the chemo time being in hospital. So we got a sort of a good range of experiences within hospital, and Sophie really picked out that hospitals were a boring place to be. She obviously was in a room on her own, and because of obviously that she had cancer, but also I think, you know, COVID as well. So, you know, we could be on there for a good week, 2 weeks, stuck in a room. Sophie really picked out that play for her was the bit, seeing the play specialist or play leader was the bit that broke up the time. Otherwise, it was just me and her, which she said, you know, as much as she loved me, it did get a bit boring at times. 24 hours a day with your mum is probably not what you would want when you're feeling not very well either. So it would brighten her day, just even, you know, an hour or half an hour. But what she found out is that the play team were only there Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And she said when she was at weekend, am I not allowed to play at a weekend then? Is that what they're saying? And she said, why can't this be changed? Why can't they have someone that works 7 days a week? We also found that people would, if the play specialist had taken like a week's leave or was sick that day, no one would cover them. So she would say, well, I'm not on leave. I'm not sick. I'm still here. Why can't someone come and play? Why can't they replace it? They said they wouldn't have nurses have leave and not have replace them. Why can't they do that with the play team? So during her treatment, this became a bigger thing for her. We also had 7 weeks of radiotherapy, and obviously the same thing was discovered as well about the play. She was just like more and more going, this is just the same everywhere. I'm just bored of the hospitals. The other big thing for Sophie is that she loved her food. From the day she was born, she loved her food. Food was sort of the center of everything that she did. And obviously going into hospital, she very quickly said, I am not eating this food. This is disgusting. And found the choices in the different hospitals. There was a variety. Wasn't always child friendly. It wasn't always given at the times that she felt like eating, so she would be vomiting into a sick bucket and then her dinner would be brought in. It's not always the time you want to be eating. And she actually couldn't even stomach the smell of the food. I remember going for an appointment with her and she could smell it was the serving up time for lunch or dinner. And that would actually make her feel sick, that just from the smell. It seemed to have the same smell all the time. So certainly food for Sophie, she actually started to refuse to eat from the moment she walked into the hospital to the moment we walked out. As soon as we're out those doors, she started eating again. And that was for her saying, I am not eating this food. And if you want me to eat some food, then you get me out because I'm not eating what you're serving me. She also found it really tough during our treatment is that I obviously never left her side. you know, she wanted me, obviously went to a few different hospitals and during our journey, she, you know, particularly when we were, you know, way away from home, she didn't want me to leave the hospital. You know, she was scared, as you would be at that age. But there was very little facilities for parents to eat. COVID, I imagine, has obviously impacted on the ability. So they obviously, different restaurants within the hospital, they would have, they've made them obviously that parents couldn't access. But also the variety or choice or ability to even order food from your ward was not there. So Sophie used to say, Mum, you order the food and pretend I'm eating it, but you eat it because I know you're going to be fed, because I don't want you to leave the room. But of course, she couldn't stomach the smell. So when the food did come, and it wasn't great food, I can agree with her that the food was not great. I actually can't believe that you can get a chip cooked so badly that it's a bullet. I actually didn't realise that was possible. And that, so yeah, it was. I certainly learned what was the best foods to choose and what wasn't. But I had to, because there was nowhere else to eat on the ward, because, you know, rooms were closed due to COVID, they had to use them for other things. I was eating in the ensuite toilet in our bathroom, that was attached to our bay, because then there was nowhere else to eat. And as much as that is probably not what you want, you know, having sat on the toilet eating your dinner, going into the room, closing the door so she couldn't smell the food, and actually getting something to eat. Sophie finished her treatment in April 2021. She still had a tiny little amount of tumour left, but it was, you know, dormant. She was on maintenance chemo, and really starting to, you know, do well. So she was having chemo every day on maintenance. But sadly, 8 weeks later, we discovered through an MRI a brand new tumour had started to grow, near enough next to the one that has remained dormant. And obviously at that point, because of the issues of the toxicity from the treatment that she'd had for the last 9 rounds, she couldn't have the relapse treatment offered, because the issues with the bowel that had caused. So and anything that was offered was about giving us time rather than a cure. So we'd sort of decided, we did try one to try and see if we could hold it, give us a bit more time, but that didn't work at all. So we decided, along with the doctors, that actually for Sophie, she hated being in hospital, that the right thing would be that we go and make memories and, you know, enjoying the time we got left. So she wrote her bucket list, which included some amazing experiences that you would as a 9-year-old. She knew she was dying. We did tell her that. So she knew that writing some of these things on might not achieve in her lifetime that was left, but she wanted to make sure that I achieved them for her. And the 3 were play specialist 7 days a week in all hospitals. She wanted better food for children, and she wanted parents to be fed. And I think to write that on a bucket list, knowing you're dying, I think at any age, just shows how much that meant to her, and how much that actually needs to change. These weren't things that were gonna make a difference to her. they wouldn't help her. She obviously didn't, you know, she wasn't going to be in hospital to experience those, but actually they meant so much. She did get some good things. She did get to meet Gordon Ramsay and cook with him, which was a good thing. She did get to go Gucci shopping. She put some amazing things on, which we achieved all of them. So Sophie obviously relapsed in the June, and then from July onwards we stopped treatment, and she sadly died in September. So very quickly, and quicker than what they, you know, everyone thought. But she achieved everything she set out to do, bar the 3 things we've got left. And that's what we need to change. I know some things have started to, you know, make change, but we need this across all hospitals, because actually my story or Sophie's story is not unique to one hospital and shouldn't just be one local hospital that makes changes because of what Sophie has said. We want this across the board, because actually we are just one of many parents whose children have either cancer or have other issues and result in being in hospital, and they all deserve to have play 7 days a week, to you know, have their parent, this parent that stays to be fed, and not have to stress about where they're going to go and find food, and that the food for children is improved, so actually they eat some food.
Gordon Ramsay thing sounds great. I hope he didn't swear at her though.
He did. He loved it. Kept in contact ever since. He's such a nice man.
Oh, good.
He's
That's
been
good.
absolutely amazing. He could have just done what he needed to for the PR bit and the, you know, ticking the box and saying what she's done, because she obviously, she met, you know, she went on this morning and, you know, met Holly, and she did loads of things, but, and they obviously did their bit and went, but Gordon, he just, I think, got encapsulated by Sophie, which is what Sophie was like. Whoever met her just wouldn't have forgotten her. Some amazing stuff. One of her favourite things was driving around in an ice cream van and serving ice cream to all of her friends. So I don't know where she got these ideas from. I was like, how am I going to do that? But yeah, we had all these offers of ice cream vans in the end. So she loved that, but I've never seen size of ice creams like she poured. Her friends thought she was the best ever.
Hi, I'm Sophie and this is my story. I have a rare form of cancer at age 9. My mum started a blog about me and my journey. Later on I decided to make a TikTok account, which I love. I have to go to London for 6 weeks for radiotherapy. Very soon. Not that much, it's just that I haven't got hair. So much. Because I've only ever spent one night. No, not even a night. Less than a night. Well, if I'm outside, I would like to wear one if I'm seeing like someone else. But if I am in the house with just my family, I don't really. So at hospital, I was obviously bored, because that's what I am always in hospital. And then they offered me to paint a ceramic. At first, I did terrible, but I managed to sell one to this doctor for £10, and then it just started a massive business. Or I make chemo easier. As the parents get food,